Welcome back to part 2 of Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 91. This week in macro. In part 1, we covered the covert central bank digital currency and the IMF battle with the Bitcoin strategy in El Salvador, as well as the suicide mission of the UK and their Bitcoin strategic reserves and the disappearing Bitcoin strategic reserves of America. In part 2, we're going to be covering two main topics. I'll cover everything that happened this week in macro with the tariffs and everything else. But of course, we're going to be covering shortly, I'm going to play a video of the theater that happened between Trump and Powell at the headquarters of the Proof of Weapons Network, the Federal Reserve. And I'm going to be pointing you to a blog where I covered and demystified the whole conspiracy theory around who controls the world, who controls the Proof of Weapons Network, when people in my comments always say it's the Jews that control it. I'm going to make sure you understand the truth, and I'm going to cover that all within the context of what happened this week in macro. So what happened this week? Well, we've been having this slow build-up. We've been covering this all the way before Trump was in control. I said you'll have this battle between Trump and Powell, and the fact that Trump mainly is represented by the financial industrial complex and the technical industrial complex. The Fed has both the financial industrial complex as well as the military industrial complex. And there's a battle as more military becomes technical and more financial becomes more technical. You got this power struggle at the top, and Powell is the mechanism for protecting legacy finance, while Trump is there protecting legacy finance as well as this transition into the technical factions as well. And so Trump has been calling for Powell's resignation. He's been posting it on Truth Social. He's been calling it out on his various interviews when he gets off the plane and all these different, kind of Jerry Springer drama that we're used to in the real world. And he's been calling the Federal Reserve to do the highest decrease in rates, 300 basis points, which during COVID, we only had 100 basis points, which in the history of the Federal Reserve was the highest decrease. Trump wants to do 300 basis points. So you can take the distressed debt of America that needs to be refinanced and refinance it at the short term at the lower rates, which would send the long-term rates out of control, so that the banks and financial institutions get their higher rates on the long term. And he gets to refinance the debt at the short term, and a typical BlackRock type of distressed asset vassalize the economy further into debt enslavement, debt dependency that causes more civil unrest, because the haves, those close to the central bank, get the benefit. Those that don't own the assets get more and more enslaved into debt slavery, and then you can usher in the surveillance state that is going to be packaged up as pretending it's for border control, when Palantir's technology just gets used on you through the privatized military like ICE, as it is beta testing with its partnership between America and El Salvador through the privatized prison sector and deportation business model for the Proof of Weapons Network right now. And Trump has been perfect. He's done everything that they want to usher in. And obviously the Jeffrey Epstein that we covered last week files are being used in order to ensure that he does exactly what they say, weaken his support at the base, and just be weaponized, because it's the Proof of Weapons Network that control the Epstein files. I don't even think Trump has access to those. I'll cover a few more updates that in part 3 as well, the geopolitical section as well. So what did we have? We also had Congresswoman Luna that came out and filed an actual criminal referral against the Federal Reserve and the chair, Jerome Powell, and that is actually happening with the Department of Justice around this refurbishment that allegedly has taken $3.1 billion from taxpayers in order to make the headquarters of the Federal Reserve nice and pristine. And there was a bit of a theater that we've become used to. We covered the Zelensky theater and the South African president theater, the Keir Starmer theater, these theaters. But now this one was done at the Federal Reserve headquarters as well. At the same time, while this was happening, while Trump was visiting the site at the Federal Reserve and the refurb, and that now has a Department of Justice case against it, which Trump is weaponizing in order to ask Jerome Powell to retire, to engage in this strategic weakening of the dollar campaign, Besant came out and said that the Fed needs complete restructuring. So the MAGA fans get to say, we're taking on the deep state and the European bankers, when really it is giving more power to the yield, because all these assets sit on the back. I've got ahead of myself. Let's watch the video first. So just before we do that, in this video, basically Trump told Jerome Powell in the Federal Reserve that you must lower interest rates. And this is amid the basically $3 billion refurb. So enjoy the theater, and then we'll come back into what it actually means for macro. And Azad, if you could play the video with Trump and Jerome Powell at the Federal Reserve. Let's play that now.
Well, thank you very much. We're looking at the construction, and we're with the chairman, as you know. Chairman, come on over. And we're just taking a look at what's happening. You know, it's a tough construction job. They're building basements where they didn't exist or expanding them, and a lot of very expensive work. There's no question about it. And Tim has been with me for a long time, and you're in charge of the committee.
Indeed. One of the reasons why I wanted to see it was the overruns of the expenses, wanted to figure out why.
Yeah. So we're taking a look, and it looks like it's about 3.1 billion. It went up a little bit, or a lot. So the 2.7 is now 3.1.
I'm not aware of that.
Yeah, it just came out.
Yeah, I haven't heard that from anybody at the Fed.
Yeah, it just came out.
Our notes had it about 3.1 as well.
3.1.
3.2.
This came from us?
Yes. I don't know who does that.
You're including the Martin renovation. You just added.
That's our entire capital.
Yeah, you just added in a third building. Is what that is. That's a third building,
Well,
including
no,
the
but
Martin building.
it's a building that's being built.
No, it was built 5 years ago. We finished Martin 5 years ago.
It's part of the overall work.
But it's
So,
not new.
So we're going to take a look. We're going to see what's happening, and it's got a long way. Do you expect any more additional cost overruns?
Don't expect them. We're ready for them, but we have a little bit of a reserve that we may use. But no, we don't. We expect to be finished in 2027. We're well along, as you can see.
Nice to take these off every once in a while when we're not under too much danger. So, any questions?
Mr. President, does the issue give you any? As a real estate developer, what would you do with a project manager who would be over budget?
Generally speaking, what would I do? I'd fire them.
Do you think this issue, Mr. President, gives you cause to do that?
Well, I'm here just really with the chairman. He's showing us around, showing us the work. And so I don't want to get that. I don't want to be personal. I just would like to see it get finished. And in many ways, it's too bad it started. But it did start. And it's been under construction for a long time. It's going to be a real long time, because it looks like it's got a long way to go.
Yes, sir.
So.
President, are there things the chairman can say to you today that would make you back off some of the earlier criticism?
Well, I'd love him to lower interest rates. But other than that, what can I tell you? The country is doing really well. I just briefed the chairman on the deal we made with Japan. Japan is putting up $550 billion in order to lower their tariffs a little bit. That way they have a little bit lower tariff. And they also opened their country to free trade, which nobody thought was even a possibility. And we get a zero tariff in the free trade. We don't pay tariffs, and they're going to pay 15% on everything they send into our country. So it's great. But they put up, as you could call it, seed money. Let's call it seed money. You could call it anything you want, but it's a total of $550 billion. So nobody thought any of that was possible, and it's wonderful. And we're doing pretty well with the European Union, likewise. And we have some others. They're all really big, and our country is going to make a lot of money. We would be helped if interest rates would come down, but we're going to see how the board rules on that soon. I'd love to see them come down a lot, but we have a country that's thriving. We had a dead country 1 year ago. Today we have the hottest country anywhere in the world, and we'll get this one finished.
Mr. President, do you
Thank
think
you.
that Jerome Powell's announcement?
Okay, so obviously it is hugely comical for us to watch the what looks like the overpowering president of the United States executing his humiliation ritual on the way more powerful Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve is a vital part of the proof of weapons network. It's not the top, the asset managers are the top, but is the enabler of the monetary policy when the banksters meet every week and the chairman is not the almighty or powerful. He's a puppet for the banks. But the president is also a puppet for the bank lobby and the other lobby interests that he needs to serve. But obviously the game has to be that the president looks like the almighty king. And this was a humiliation ritual around the strategic campaign that I've been covering ever since Liberation Day, that I said the tariffs would weaken the dollar. And now we're getting the trends as a result. The more and more of these campaigns we get an ever weakening dollar, and we get the cost on the 10-year bonds and the 30-year bonds in that bull market. What that means is that the government has to pay more in order to lend to anybody that wants to lend to the US government for 10-year and 30-year. If you have to pay more because bonds are crashing, it means that people are not willing to lend unless you're willing to pay a higher rate in these auctions. And so Trump's strategy is to basically forget about the free market, do fiscal dominance, which means spend like crazy, give free subsidies to the military industrial complex, the technical industrial complex, the financial industrial complex, hand over as much money, have a $5 trillion debt ceiling so that you can engage in crony capitalism, but you can force the Fed to cut the rates right down so that you pay a small amount on the short-term interest rate, which is kind of acting like a distressed emerging market debt, collateralized debt obligation, which is Trump's strategy. So then they can try and grow while they usher in this artificial intelligence and robotic technocracy, and the tariffs reset the world order and divert capital around the world because you don't want to pay those tariffs. And it also creates a bit of inflation internally. And it's not going to rebuild the manufacturing base unless it's done by artificial intelligence and robotics, which takes away jobs. So you need to protect yourself amongst these inflationary, deflationary, unemployment, employment, where the unemployment numbers, I keep reporting them, and then they come back and say, oh, no, that wasn't the number. So they keep lying about the employment numbers. And then what are they doing with these stimulus, big, beautiful bill? The government's employing more people. So you're ending up with this, government getting bigger and bigger and bigger, the banks ending up with all the debt, the stable coin issuers able to handle that debt on the short term. And then long term, you're getting these higher and higher rates, which support the assets on the Federal Reserve, as well as the banks and the financial industrial complex, which have like $10 trillion of assets that it always needs to roll over. Cut out there. So I'm back now. This is essentially a collateralized debt obligation on a debt-based Ponzi scheme where the debt is the beneficiary of the Federal Reserve and the bank. So let me just walk through a little bit of the flow so you understand it, and then I'll tie it into tariffs. And then I'm going to share a little bit around a blog that I created so you can understand who really benefits from this stuff when you actually follow the money. Okay, so basically now Trump works for one of the most important lobbies, which is the bank lobby. And the shareholders of the Federal Reserve are the banks. And so the banks get to implement their Federal Reserve policy. You put in a puppet chair, that essentially the Trump administration or the current president appoints, because remember, Trump hired Powell in his last administration, kind of forgetting about that and trying to blame it on Biden and the Democrats. And you got to believe all this. It's the Democrats. They control the proof. They're the corrupt ones. The Republicans, we're taking on the deep state. When they are the deep state, it's all the same system, just a different flavor. But the Fed is owned by the banks. So remember that. The shareholders of the Fed are the banks. The banking lobbies are essentially one of the most powerful lobbies. So you pay for their political campaigning. You pay for Trump. And Trump's second largest backer after Elon Musk, which is part of the technical industrial complex, was the Mellon banking family, legacy banking family. His third was Adelson, which is the Israel part, the Israeli lobby, and she's a big investor in illegal Israeli settlements, hence why he wants real estate by engaging in these crimes that we'll be covering in part 3. And what does the Federal Reserve have? Well, quantitative easing, which we're told it has been engaging in quantitative tightening, which it has, but it still has $2 trillion of mortgage-backed securities on the Federal Reserve balance sheet. In total, it's got $10 trillion of government debt and mortgage-backed securities. Now, the Federal Reserve pays its shareholders a 6% dividends to the banks. The amount in excess goes back to Treasury, which is meant to reduce the amount of tax that is paid. But the banks get to create the digital dollar every time they issue a loan, which is mainly backed by real estate. And so when you have a strategy that Trump is following of fiscal dominance, which means essentially the government just spends its way into growth by creating fake GDP prints, by making the average American that doesn't own assets inflation. And then that money goes back around to the corporations that have the biggest lobby, the technical industrial complex, the financial industrial complex, the military industrial complex, the pharmaceutical industrial complex. And so who is this strategy good for? It's good for the banks. So the banks get monetary policy and fiscal dominance. That's why the debt-based Ponzi scheme was created this way. It's a predatory value extraction tool to benefit those that are closest to the money printer. And nobody is closer to the money printer than those that get to create the digital dollar, which is the banks themselves. And we covered more on the stablecoin side in part 1 this week in Bitcoin. And so the long-term rates are steadily rising the more crazy the economy goes, which is good for the bondholders or the ones that are going to be, buying those 10-year and 30-year bonds, which is the banks. That's their collateral. They can then issue stable coins against it, as we covered in part 1. And this is hugely beneficial for the banks. Now, the banks are global, so they don't care about America first. They can invest globally, and whatever happens in America, they're happy to keep rolling it over, and they'll just use it as a host country for the debt capital markets, equity capital markets, and the technocracy and the military might. So essentially, they get to socialize the losses and privatize the gains again. And that's the way the system is rigged. So if you want to, if you want to beat the system, because many people are blaming the boomers that benefited from this system. Like in 20 years, their houses quadrupled in price. And there is no way that the new young generation are able to buy houses anymore, because their wages are not increasing at the same rate that these houses are inflating and these assets are inflating. So it's creating a lot of tension between the young and the old. And the young are essentially waiting to inherit those assets because they can't get ahead in the system. And the older people are benefiting from it because they don't want it to end, because they don't want the assets to go down in value before they retire. And at the same time, you've got all these people that are about to retire that is putting stress on the pension system, which is why we're having this fiscal dominant strategy. It's a pure Ponzi scheme to the highest level. And as long as people will buy the debt, it will continue. But we're having those real signs of stress right now. And so what you have to do as a young person, and I want to give some practical advice here, you have to flip the system. Forget about buying your house or using a house as a mechanism, unless you're going to inherit it, in order to become wealthy, because even rents are getting higher and higher as the concentration of wealth of real estate is essentially those that could benefit from the debt-based Ponzi scheme. And so you can sit here and wait for a crash when the government won't let it crash because they're owned by the banks and no one cares about the people anymore. Or you have to flip the system, which is why I've always said for 14 years, earn as much fiat currency as you can, save the difference in Bitcoin, continue to do that for 4 years. And after 4 years, everybody that's done that, and I can't promise the future, but I have been saying this all along, beats every asset class, beats real estate, beats Wall Street, beats the fund manager, beats the banks, beats the bonds, beats the stock market, beats gold, beats the commodities, beats art. And that has happened every 4 years. Once you hit 4 years of buying every month, no matter, regardless what the price is, the people that I know, some of them are billionaires, some of them are millionaires, average Joe people, and some of them are continuing this strategy. They end up just buying their house outright because they saved in Bitcoin rather than saving in fiat currency and lending it to the US government or the UK government or wherever you're from in your local currency. So you have to save in an asset that outperforms the market and then eventually just buy your house. And this happens to also, and I'll be tying this together in part 3 when I talk about practical strategies in the geopolitical section about how we can boycott the war machine. And also at the end of this, in terms of understanding, this is how we take on the proof of weapons network. And so this is the strategy that I ask everyone to follow. Now, is there risk in Bitcoin? Maybe you want to hedge it with gold and various other things. There's risk in all of this stuff. But it is consistently provided a neutral asset that has beaten all other assets because of its fixed money supply that no one can change. Now, let's look at some of the other asset class and the alternatives. So for the last 15 years, I've been investing in private equity. I often talk about, I try to disclose my private equity investments. I've been investing in many of the different companies in Bitcoin and various other private equity investments. But now, as the world is changing, we're seeing that traditional private equity investors are needing a stimulus because they can't find the liquidity in order to sell those shares. And so we're seeing in this new environment more and more distress in the private equity market. One of the things that I've been working on is converting all of my private equity into Bitcoin because I don't want the human risk anymore. I don't want all the hassles that can happen when you can just have this one asset that has taken out the human risks. Not financial advice. You need to do what's right for you. I don't know your situation. I can't give this generic financial advice. Obviously doesn't work when I don't know your situation. But what has been happening is that the private equity lobbies have been lobbying the Trump administration in order to allow the 401k pensions in America to be able, those providers to be able to open up to private equity. Now, this is one thing. When you have the 401k pension providers lobbying the government saying, we would like our pensions to have access to private equity, that's about inclusion in a vibrant asset class. Because historically, before Bitcoin, you had to invest in private equity to get the higher returns. And that was, what I used to do. So when I worked in investment banking, I was doing it in public markets. But once I got into the private markets, I was doing private equity and centered around Bitcoin, which was the higher performers because of Bitcoin as well. But liquidity is completely drying up at the moment. So if it is the private equity sector lobbying and not the pension sector lobbying, then to me, I interpret that as wanting to dump their private equity on retirement funds of everyday people because institutions aren't buying. And remember, institutions, the fastest growing ETF for institutions is the Bitcoin ETF. So you got to read between this as well. And so what might be happening here, and again, just following the money, I can't prove the flows, I'll keep following the flows, but the private equity part of the financial industrial complex of the proof of weapons network, companies like Blackstone, may be dumping on the mutual funds and the pension parts of the financial industrial complex. And this is another reason why I prefer Bitcoin than holding Bitcoin with BlackRock or having BlackRock manage my pension. Again, I can't, don't take this as financial advice. You really need to manage your risks, your situation. But I'm just saying generically, BlackRock, through their pension funds, could be buying the private equity through its other parts of the portfolio. Massive conflict of interest. And the way that private equity works is it's very hard to price it. And so what you often do in our private equity deals, sometimes you have people do a low deal at a lower price, and then that becomes the price, or you can do a higher deal at a higher price. That becomes the price. And when you're dealing with your own people in your own networks, you could end up dumping this private equity at higher prices, finding more liquidity while they go into more liquid assets. And these are the types of things that tend to happen when you're having moments of mass disruption around, like we are with this transition to artificial intelligence. And now we have an asset class like Bitcoin as well. So you can do a small deal in order to get a price for a higher deal. And if you can find a liquid market, then you could be dumping onto the pensioners again. And so, look, I think this is more appropriate for a IRA where people manage their own pension and they can make their own decision. But when it comes to somebody else manage, I see massive conflicts here. It could be the formation of the next scandal. And it could be a way of getting illiquid assets in a distressed private equity market into more liquid markets, and you holding the bag. So I'll keep watching this as well. At the same time, this $9 trillion locked up in 401 are also going to be able to invest in Bitcoin and crypto. So they could be hedging, saying, we'll dump our private equity, but we'll hedge it with Bitcoin and Bitcoin, quote unquote, crypto. But this is what's happening in the 401k. Is essentially they get a fee, they get to dump their positions, and then if Bitcoin continues to outperform, it will be offset some of the losses from the private equity, and they get to say, well, we gave you market returns when you could have just had the high returns of Bitcoin anyway, by understanding some of this. Anyway, we discussed more on Bitcoin being in 401ks last week as well. But speaking of conflicts, I wanted to point another thing that's happening in the macro market. So we've got distressed private equity. I discussed in the real estate market and some of the things that are happening as well. But there was also a conflict around the tariff policy. I noticed that Cantor Fitzgerald and the Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick of the Trump administration was the person that founded Cantor Fitzgerald and now handed it over to be managed by his son. But they launched a new product, which was essentially buying tariffs from distressed small business. So remember what I said, the impact of tariffs. You have bankruptcies in all the small markets that are sucking up the tariff. And this is what's happening right now. We're getting an increase in bankruptcies. The large multinational institutions can gobble them up and offset their tariffs in the international negotiations and markets. But what they're doing is they're saying, we will buy your tariff, and if the tariff doesn't happen, we'll refund you, but we'll keep 20%. And so I don't know whether tariffs will or will not happen. I think that they're going to come through. But anyway, this is a product from somebody that would have insider information, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, through his institution, creating a product saying that tariffs may not happen and will get a cut if they work out differently from what is in the contract. And so this could be complete insider trade. And this is the types of things that we're seeing as the market gets more and more distressed on the macro side, that there's ever more corruption to increase these prints to make it look like there is growth as well. Now, at the same time, we had lots and lots of announcements around tariffs, because remember, the next key deadline is August the 1st. That's just around the corner. And so in the humiliation ritual between Trump and Powell, he was bragging about the deal that was being done by Japan. So let's go through into some of the deals that we've got already. Now, remember, there were some deals that were being done that led to Trump issuing a stable coin where the negotiated money that was going to be invested went via World Liberty Financial, which is Steve Witkoff and Trump, both on the administration. And then he gets to receive the interest on the bonds from those stable coins as he gets more deals to go through via these types of mechanism. Well, Trump struck essentially a trade deal. Now, remember, the trade deal is not for America. It's for the proof of weapons network. It's government is subordinate to the corporate interests. And so Trump's job is to negotiate deals for these global multinational financial institutions. So he announced that deals have been done with Japan, with Philippines, and with Indonesia, three major Asian countries, major trading partners. I'll quote, it was in the humiliation ritual, I think he said, Trump said, Japan will invest $550 billion into the United States, which will receive 90% of the profits. I'm not sure what that means. The devil's in the detail. I'd have to understand the flow of money of exactly how that works, but we don't have the details yet. Japan will open up their country to trade, including cars, trucks, rice, and certain other agricultural products, and other things, he said. And basically, Japan's prime minister came out and said that he welcomes the announcement on Wednesday. And he's adding that he expects the agreement, quote, to contribute to the world economy. Japan's tariffs rate was set to increase to 25%, he said on Wednesday, but it was announced at 19%. But there was confusion around reciprocal. So does that mean that it's 19% on both sides? But it looks like it was announced that it was going to be kept at 15%, but in the end, he said 19%. So we'll see what the final thing is. But he said this is the lowest figure to date among countries with trade surpluses with the US. And so the agreement basically does not include any reductions on tariffs on the Japanese side. And that includes the agricultural products. So we're getting these conflicting messages between announcements. And obviously, I've covered in previous episodes in macro the importance of following if Japan goes on its own strategy, the Japan carry trade and the various other things, and how Japan is sowing signals for what could happen within America. You can check out previous cutouts if you want to watch that on my YouTube channel and specifically get into that topic. But in the end, essentially, he announced that there would be a 19% tariff on Japan and also on imports from the Philippines. And also Indonesia is set to get the 19% rate. So across the board, we're seeing these higher rates in Brazil for political reason. It looks like we may be getting an average of about 25%, which is higher than the current 10%, which means that we haven't seen the inflationary impact yet. Still all to come throughout the Trump administration, which is why Jerome Powell was saying we don't know the impact yet, so we're not going to be lowering rates because inflation has had a rebound, while Trump is pressuring, and this is why we're getting the weakening of the dollar and more distress in the market as a result of the sophisticated investors repricing based upon this destabilization campaign. It's agreed that Indonesia will be opening up the market to America industry and tech products and agricultural goods by eliminating basically 99% of their tariff barriers. So large multinational financial institutions that are not America first, that host themselves on the US stock market, are having more and more free trade so they can offset any tariffs in the international markets while they also purchase any of the distressed companies. And as I said, this is consolidation of wealth to the top, which is why I've always thought the tariffs was BlackRock's policy, and they allowed Trump to play president to reset the world order into these multipolar world and consolidate power up to the top. There was a quote, the United States of America will now sell American-made products to Indonesia at a tariff rate of 0. While Indonesia will pay 19% on all of their products coming into the USA. Now, they frame it as that, but remember, the tariff is paid by the importing company. And America, to have world reserve currency, needs to, by Triffins Dilemma, have this trade surplus. And we now know that they're using fiscal dominance. So they don't care about paying off the national debt. So this was all a reset of the world order. And as I said, it's because China's already won the tariff war. We covered that in previous episodes. But the tariffs that are paid on the US side are paid by the importers, which increases the price and is causing the distress in the private equity bankruptcies in the smaller companies that are being purchased by the larger corporations on the cheap. Now, we also had more theater around the European Union. The European Union said that it's in planning to impose a 30% tariffs on US goods if no deal is done by the August the 1st deadline. This was also announced that they're reducing it to 15%. We had the whole tariff on, tariff off, tariff off. Trump said that he looks like we're going to be doing a deal between the European Union. But in the meanwhile, we've got the massive strategic weakening campaign and vassalization of the European Union that I've been covering on for many months now. So the impact of this basically is that the US pays 19% more on goods that it imports from the Philippines in the US. So that's inflationary. It adds to the tax revenue. So it is a tax on US companies. That's essentially what it is. The large companies will offset it in the international markets and negotiate preferential terms. So this is a beautiful deal for the proof of weapons network while being able to invest globally in BRICS and various other beneficiaries of the deals that will be done. Now everyone's being pushed east rather than west to do deals with China. Now, meanwhile, the goods that are coming to the Philippines will not be charging tariffs. So it's good for American exports and they get cheaper goods. But you've got the challenge with the corporation that needs to pay the tariff as well. So these are the impacts that I see so far. And I think it's in line with what I originally said on Liberation Day on the 2nd of April, that I said this is about liberating the world from the dollar. And the dollar has been weakening ever since. BRICS has been doing more and more trade with each other. And America has produced, Scott Bessent said, about $300 billion of tax revenue. And the big, beautiful bill is subsidizing and more crony capitalism, and the government's employing more people. So, you know, this is essentially Bidenomics under Trumponomics that is benefiting the banks, the financial industrial complex, the technical industrial complex, and the military industrial complex. This just shows that government is subordinate because it's not going to help the people, Main Street, in any way unless you own the assets. So it only benefits those that own the stocks. And outperforming the stocks, meanwhile, has been Bitcoin, which is why price your stocks in Bitcoin to get the truth. Don't price it in dollars because the weakening of the dollar is what's pumping these stocks. And then those are the executives that get rewarded in stock options. The higher the price goes, the more they get to extract. They can borrow against their stocks. They pay the interest and they get to pump the price of their stocks and have this wealth effect which is causing more wealth inequality from those that are not able to access these sophisticated products that help the banks. That's really the end impact of this. It helps Wall Street, not Main Street, is when you really follow the money. We had an announcement that Trump is in the process of completing deals with China, and it's in serious talks with the European Union. So hopefully we get those announcements, and as we get those announcements, I'll keep covering them on This Week in Macro every week. There were serious corrections in the Dow Jones stocks. So don't be fooled. While stock markets are going to new all-time highs, it's the technocracy and the energy that is distorting the impact of tariffs. Because as the price of energy goes down, that is deflationary, and that's offsetting some of the inflationary. And so you have to get into the minutia of those details as well. But the Dow Jones, like the dinosaur companies, they've had really big corrections. Some of the companies can't pay dividends anymore. So there was big correction in the prices. But the big magnificent seven, the technocracy, has been pumping that up. But in America, there's real distress in the oil markets, because the lower the price, that impacts the oil manufacturers as well. And so this is why I love Bitcoin, because the complexities, what is the average person able to do? What are they going to do? They say, I can't put all this shit together, so I'm going to hand my money over to BlackRock. And that's the strategy. That's why. Whereas Bitcoin produces a counter to that. You know the monetary policy. You just have to learn how Bitcoin works. Then you have to get a setup. Life gets simpler. So Dow Jones, massive corrections in stocks, while technology props up the stock market. And you get these new all-time highs, but the devil's in the micro detail rather than the macro detail. US technocracy is absolutely inevitable, and that's why the whole economy is reconfiguring around that reality. And the reason why I believe there's going to be, a movement towards peaceful negotiations by the Proof of Weapons Network in the Middle East, which is my geopolitical type of forecast based upon following the money, because there's not enough energy to power all this artificial intelligence. And so what I wanted to do as a final section in This Week in Macro, before we go into This Week in Geopolitics in part 3, where I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into, the whole Ukraine, Russia, China, Taiwan situation, and who's profiting, a bit more on the Epstein files and some of the updates as well on This Week in Geopolitics. I wanted to point you to a blog that I recently created. Now, this was created because whenever I talk about the Proof of Weapons Network, I immediately get confronted in the comment section and with people on Spaces that immediately say to me, when you say the Proof of Weapons Network, you mean the Jews, don't you? And so I always push back upon that and then try and explain the structure. And of course, Jewish power is one part of the faction. But I wanted to actually find out how influential and powerful is it actually? Because I've always known, the historical stories between the scapegoating, Jewish power, Christian power, weaponizing religion, all of this stuff. And I just wanted to create a blog so that whenever someone comes to me saying, is that what you mean? I'd like them to actually just have the reality. Now, there's no doubt that, there are apparently 15 million Jewish people in the world, and they have a lot of board seats, and there are a lot of billionaires that have influence in these different markets. So I wanted to drill down and find out, is it true, because of this historical context and the situation today, that is the source of power? And I knew intuitively how markets work. And so therefore, the conspiracy theory doesn't tell the whole story. But I wanted to make sure I had a blog that actually answers the question, who controls the world and who controls the Proof of Weapons Network? And I wanted to break it down. So, my theory was that actually it's controlled by shareholders. And anybody that knows anything about corporate structure, that boards are employed by shareholders. Now, you can have CEOs that were also founders, but the power comes from the shareholders. And so when you're a founder, CEO, and shareholder, yes, you have significant power, and you could use ideological reasons, mainly in the private markets, to push an alternative agenda to profit. But in the public market, you have fiduciary duties to prioritize profits over any spiritual, religious, ideological, any type of ideology, unless it serves profit for shareholders. And you risk being sued if you deviate from that. And with public companies, you have to produce quarterly reports. And also, executives are incentivized through stock options. So the higher the share price, if you crucify your share price for ideological reasons, it's just not, it means that you don't get the maximum result. The whole system is designed around profits. And so CEOs and board members are resistant to shareholders. So what people do is they point out, oh, this board member comes from this religious background, or is in this tribe, and therefore they control the world. And it's just, it's a source of power, but it's not the full power. And this is understood based upon, it gives us also a way of of determining who is these powers. So I tried to find any studies around, as wealth, what are the ideologies behind different pockets of wealth? Because wealth is what determines whether you own shares. And so wealth in public companies changes because wealth is open up to global markets. And so you could have Chinese power, you can have Asian power, you can have Muslim power, you can have Jewish power, you can have Christian power, you can have, when you try and put together these groups, and it's mainly determined by wealth and stock ownership rather than executive. And so what about other sources of power, like strategic lobbying? We're always told, and I always talk about APAC, but I wanted to find out, where is APAC in relation to military industrial complex lobby? What about foreign registered lobbies like Saudi Arabia and various others? And so I condensed it all down into a blog this week, because every time somebody tells me, do Jews rule the world, or is the Proof of Weapons Network a using covert word for Jews? I just wanted to actually have a blog where I could say them, so I don't need to answer this question or debate ever again on this topic, unless you can find some flaws in my blog, in which case I'll update the blog based upon reality, because only the truth matters. That's all I care about. And so are the Jewish people on top of the Proof of Weapons Network, as some people would lead you to believe, which is obviously with the Gaza genocide at the moment, people are coming to these types of conclusions, and scapegoating and all these types of narratives are happening again. And so what I want to do right now is play you a little artificial intelligence summary, which will be the last thing we do in This Week in Macro, that gives you an introduction to the blog. And then you can head over to simondixon.com, go to the blog section and type in a keyword, and you'll be able to watch and read the whole thing for people that want to dive deeper into this subject. So I don't need to debate it again. And you're welcome to provide some feedback, tag me on X and tell me where you think I'm wrong, and I'll update, and we can do a real-time thing. And so for the final section of part 2 of Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 91, on whether the Genius Act is a covert central bank digital currency, I'm going to answer the question and play you a little AI summary from that blog on who controls the Proof of Weapons Network. So Azad, if we could play the video, and then we'll go into part 3, This Week in Geopolitics.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise on some really complex stuff. Today, we're tackling a big one, a really powerful and, let's face it, often debated claim. This idea that, that the Jews rule the world. You hear it around. It's one of those claims that really needs a clear-eyed look, So we're going to unpack the actual power structures. We'll be using insights from Simon Dixon, particularly his work on the Proof of Weapons Network. Yeah. Our mission here is simple. Just lay out the information impartially. We want to clarify the complex realities, focus on the mechanisms of power, okay? We're not taking sides on, the politically charged stuff.
Exactly. And Dixon's core idea is this Proof of Weapons Network. He sees it as this web of powerful industrial complexes, think military, financial, tech, even pharma. And his argument is they actually engineer conflicts for profit, often by shaping narratives, funding different sides. It gets complex. And what's really striking is how he says they sometimes weaponize religion, create heroes and villains, using old biases for modern gain. He also highlights this corporate power structure, where shareholders, they have the final say. CEOs, boards, they answer to the shareholders. And it's all driven by that relentless pressure for quarterly returns.
Okay, right. So let's unpack that specific claim head on.
Okay.
The whole Jews own everything narrative, when you actually look at the data on global wealth, it doesn't hold up. The numbers are pretty startlingly clear, actually. Like, Christians own about 55% of global wealth.
Up to 5%.
Yeah. People with no religion, around 35%. Muslims, maybe 6%. And Jews, just 1%.
Okay.
1%.
Exactly. And let's talk billionaires for a second. You got what, around 2,668 globally? Only about 10% of those are Jewish, which means obviously 90% are not.
90%.
Right. And look at the very top names, the ones everyone knows. Musk, Bezos, Arnault. Overwhelmingly non-Jewish. The numbers just don't support this idea of financial domination by one religious group. And actually, trends since about 2015 show Muslim-majority economies growing faster in percentage terms. Jewish wealth, while definitely influential in certain areas, is relatively shrinking on the global scale.
So, okay, it's clearly not about one religious or ethnic group hoarding all the wealth. Then who is pulling the strings? In these huge corporations, these key sectors Dixon talks about in his network, you look at the big banks, right? JP Morgan Chase, or big tech, the Magnificent Seven.
NVIDIA, Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Meta, Microsoft.
Yeah.
Yeah, the giants.
And the media conglomerates, the huge military contractors like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon. Who owns them? It's mostly institutional investors, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street. Those names keep popping up.
And here's the really crucial bit, I think. These asset managers, they aren't driven by ideology, Jewish or otherwise. Their loyalty, it's to quarterly returns, full stop, shareholder supremacy, which then leads you to ask, well, who owns them?
Right.
And it gets interesting because BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, they own big chunks of each other.
Seriously, they own each other.
Significant shares, yeah. It creates this really complex, intertwined web. Dixon calls it decentralized ownership, centralized control. It's a bit of a mind bender.
Decentralized ownership, centralized control.
Think of it like a web where the same few spiders control the anchor points of almost every strand. So no single person owns everything, but these few firms, they collectively wield enormous influence through all these cross-holdings.
Wow. Okay, so zooming out, it's not ethnicity, it's these huge financial structures. That really shifts the perspective. And beyond just ownership, there's lobbying, right? Political influence. Let's compare some numbers there. Pro-Israel groups, Jewish organizations like AIPAC.
The big one, yeah. American Israel Public Affairs Committee.
They put about $30 million into U.S. campaigns in the 2023-24 cycle.
Which sounds like a lot of money. And it is.
But compare that to U.S. defense corporations in the same period.
Yeah.
They spent $149 million just on lobbying.
$149 million versus $30 million.
Yeah. That's almost 5 times more.
And if you connect that to the bigger picture Dixon paints, U.S. policy seems driven primarily by lobbying money, military strategy, and, well, corporate profit. Not really ethnicity or religion when you follow the money. It's kind of a sobering thought, but the data points that way. And institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, even the Federal Reserve.
The U.S. Central Bank.
Yeah, they're deeply tangled up with private banking interests and these same big asset managers. The Fed itself, is technically owned by a network of private commercial banks.
Which are owned by?
Largely by those institutional investors. Again, BlackRock, Vanguard. It comes back to them.
Okay, so let's bring it back to the U.S.-Israel relationship specifically, through Dixon's lens. He's arguing U.S. support isn't really about religious loyalty.
Not fundamentally, no. He calls it the cold logic of empire. In his view, Israel functions more like a strategic asset, a proxy, or he uses the term settler colony, serving U.S. geopolitical goals and, crucially, the defense industry's bottom line.
And AIPAC's role in that view.
It is basically a convenient smokescreen.
Yeah.
Something that obscures the real chain of command, the real interest at play.
That's a powerful perspective. How strategic interests might just override everything else.
So yeah, this raises a really important question, doesn't it? What's the takeaway? The real power structure, at least according to Dixon's analysis, is this consolidated system. These huge asset managers driven by profit, by endless asset accumulation. And that drive transcends any particular ethnic or religious group.
So what does this all mean for you listening? Maybe understanding this system, this profit-driven structure, instead of focusing on old, harmful stereotypes. Maybe that changes how you see things, how you view global events, the flow of power. Think about it. A system where profit often dictates action, cutting across traditional lines and allegiances. What does that really mean for the world? Something to consider next time you read the headlines.
Okay, so if you want to dig into a bit more of the details, then you're welcome to check out my blog on simondixon.com and tweet me on X, or post to me, whatever we call it now, and share what you think is you'd like to see updated on there. There is no doubt that there are powerful people, but I refuse to group everything together because I think that only leads to lazy outcomes. And so this is my blog post for any time anyone asks me that question, because the reality is that based upon everything that's happening that I'm going to be covering in the geopolitical section, Israel is really, really creating a bad reputation for all of its followers and supporters. And obviously the military industrial complex is willing to weaponize faith and religion. And also there has been radicalization. And we're going to be covering a lot more about that in part 3. But I said that we'd be focusing a bit more on the Ukraine-Russia situation by following the money, and also the China-Taiwan situation by following the money, and also give some updates on what we covered last week, just based upon this week in the Epstein case, Syria, and various other things. So we've got plenty more to cover in the final section in part 3. And I'm also going to leave the final part of part 3. I'm going to make sure that we go through some creative actions that you can take on another blog that I'll be publishing soon as well. So we're going to jump straight in now to part 3 of Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 91. The main topic, as a quick recap, was whether Genius Act is a central bank digital currency for the US. We covered that in part 1 in This Week in Bitcoin. In the macro section, we covered the power structure of the proof of weapons network, and also the theater between Jerome Powell and Trump and the tariffs. And in part 3, we're going to be focusing on the updates on the geopolitical side and following the money, and maybe making some forecasts on where Russia-Ukraine goes next and China-Taiwan goes next. And some of those updates. So let's jump into this